Not bad. Looks like a toy. Shoots like the real thing. We just need 5 more for the rest of the crew.
Oi, oi, you muddy fugglers! Get in here, sit down, we're going to read some news. The right to defend yourself is, in my opinion, sacred. I think there is no legitimate government that will imprison you for defending yourself, your family, the things that matter to you, and I think states that have stand your ground and even castle doctrine are, in my opinion, the most just. There's lots of efforts to dampen down people's enthusiasm for owning guns and self-defense in general. One of the avenues for pushing back against that rising tide of gun confiscation that's gone on throughout the Western world is the ability to print your own. In some countries, it's incredibly illegal. Anyway, this next article from The Verge, written by Mac de Guerin. Are you ready for what it takes to stop ghost guns? New laws in California and New York might stop anyone from 3D printing guns and create entirely new kinds of surveillance. Okay. This is the general direction of the modern world is everything is an excuse for more surveillance. In the summer of 2024, former Army National Guard member Andrew Scott Hastings spent a sweaty afternoon carefully packing boxes with parts he made using his 3D printer. These weren't novelty figurines or replacement IKEA pieces. The boxes were instead filled with a handful of homemade firearm lower receivers and more than 100 switches. Small devices capable of converting a semi-automatic gun into a fully automatic weapon. Their intended recipients, federal prosecutors allege, were Al-Qaeda operatives. Is Al-Qaeda still a thing now? We don't know. Months later, ATF agents busted 2 men in Colorado Springs for allegedly using 3D printers to churn out hundreds of illegal machine gun conversion devices as a part of a DIY black market. To avoid detection, the duo allegedly stuffed their products into Lego boxes and shipped them to buyers across the country. There was, however, no recent case that thrust 3D printed guns, a type of untraceable ghost gun, back into the public consciousness, quite like the killing of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson in December 2024. Suspected gunman Luigi Mangione, then 26, allegedly shot Thompson outside a Manhattan hotel using a partially 3D printed Glock-style frame and a 3D printed silencer, otherwise known as a suppressor, the latter of which would otherwise require months of federal paperwork to obtain legally. Is it legal to print your own, though? I wonder. 3D printed guns have been around for over a decade. Cody Wilson, a self-described crypto-anarchist, created the first functional printed firearm in 2013, and lawmakers and courts have tussled with how to rein them in ever since. Those efforts largely targeted the gun files themselves and the websites that hosted them, but courts have, with some exceptions, repeatedly treated gun code as a form of protected speech, frustrating gun control advocates at every turn. Though many states have passed laws specifying who can print or share gun files, they are notoriously difficult to actually enforce. Today, almost anyone with a printer, internet access, and enough patience can browse file sharing sites and attempt to make their own gun. But a new volley of legislation progressing in California and New York aims to shake up that stalemate by moving regulations from the files to the machines themselves, requiring 3D printers to employ blueprint scanning, print blocker software that, in theory, would detect gun files and stop the print before it starts. It's essentially taking the long-running debate over online content moderation and translating it to the physical world. The problem is neither New York nor California specifies what the blocking technology must actually look like. That flexibility gives the printing industry and technologists more time and freedom to experiment with different technical approaches, but it simultaneously leaves critics on edge, unsure whether a relatively contained gun control measure could eventually evolve into something closer to a broad infrastructure for file surveillance. I imagine so. If you're printing stuff, they're going to want to know what you're printing, but are we going to allow them to know? That's the question. The first rumblings of blocking technology legislation emerged in Washington state earlier this year with the HB 2321, which would have required all 3D printers sold in the state to come equipped with firearm blueprint detection algorithms, alongside a database of prohibited guns and components maintained by the state's Attorney General. I wonder, is there an overlap with non-lethal weapons, such as Nerf guns, airsoft, water pistols and stuff? A lot of these things will have most of the general functional framework of a gun anyway. How can you distinguish that? Are we going to be saying that you're not allowed to 3D print your own Nerf gun because it could be modified to be an actual gun? I don't know, just asking questions. The bill faced immediate pushback from makers and industry experts who argued it would needlessly sweep up legitimate non-firearm parts in its net and drive hobbyists away from 3D printing altogether. It died in committee, but the bill's skeleton would go on to form the backbone of ongoing efforts in California and New York. California's AB 2047 would require the state's Department of Justice to maintain an approved roster of 3D printer makes and models equipped with certified firearm blocking technology. I mean, they could blacklist specific files, I suppose. That would be the only way I imagine you could do it, is you can know what certain files contain and maybe check for patterns within other files that are similar enough to those banned ones. It would have to be some kind of blacklist scenario. The DOJ would require the ability to update and alter the requirements for that roster over time. A recent addition to the bill provides an exception for Hollywood, which regularly uses 3D printers to make gun props. If passed, manufacturers who want to sell printers in the state would have to attest that they have implemented a firearm detection algorithm approved by the government in each make and model they submit, though the details of exactly what that scanning tech entails are left unspecified. I imagine you'd then have to apply for a license to print these parts, because similar to Xeroxing and copying things in high fidelity, there are certain degrees of fidelity printers and scanners that are not allowed, or types of paper that you can't get hold of, so that creating counterfeit currency is not an issue. Maybe this is a similar thing. What is clear is that any printer sold after March 1st, 2029 that doesn't appear on the approved list would be illegal to sell in state, with civil penalties of up to $25,000 per violation. Hackers or tinkerers who knowingly disable or circumvent the blocking software on an approved printer, meanwhile, could face misdemeanor charges and potential jail time. The bill passed the California Assembly on May 26, but still needs Senate approval and a signature from Governor Gavin Newsom before becoming law. A similar effort in New York was signed into law late May. Over the past few months, Governor Kathy Hochul has described 3D printed gun parts as the fastest growing gun safety threat in the country. Gun safety, suppose, if you're determined to reduce the amount of guns out there, and has even invoked the image of gun makers supposedly printing parts on their kitchen tables. Okay. On May 22nd, the state legislature finalized the FY 2027 budget, which includes a section mandating gun blocking technology on printers sold in the state, among a handful of other anti-ghost gun provisions. New York's law goes further by applying to CNC machines and making it a felony to distribute gun files to anyone who isn't a licensed gunsmith. I think CNC machines are 3D printers that print metal. Like in California, the New York law requires every 3D printer sold in the state to include software that blocks it from printing a firearm or firearm component. And like in California, the exact specifications of what constitutes an acceptable firearm blueprint detection algorithm remain exasperatingly vague, left for a panel of experts to determine at a later date. New York specifically calls for the formation of a working group of tech and gun policy experts who will convene to make minimum safety standards this proposed blocking technology would need to meet to comply with a mandate. Crucially, the same group has to admit if they find this kind of tech is not technologically feasible. In other words, the law as written advocates in favor of technology that experts still aren't really sure will actually work. You can make it work for the vast majority of files out there. This kind of thing has been going on for quite a while, I suppose, in social media to block out media that maybe is banned. They can check the metadata of the file and figure out what the content is before anyone really looks at it. It can be flagged. So similarly, they could do that with these 3D printer files. Many of them could just be blacklisted. We've already gone after the iron pipeline, Hochul said in a March press conference in reference to ghost guns. Now we're going after the plastic pipeline. Okay. Hochul's office declined to comment about how they intend to enforce the law. Supporters argue this on-device software is needed to close an enforcement gap that lets those with felony convictions and others access weapons they otherwise couldn't legally obtain. Laws are already on the books in dozens of states prohibiting the unlicensed manufacturing of 3D printed guns, but those are nearly impossible to enforce in practice, since the printing occurs in private. Mandatory blocking technology installed on printers would, in theory at least, address the problem by stopping the job before its gun part is ever completed. In a private video, the meeting with members of the 3D printer industry obtained by The Verge, academic experts in gun policy and printer software said it's possible printer manufacturers could have various paths to compliance with the proposed laws. Rutgers University professor and New Jersey Gun Violence Research Center director of research Daniel Semenza said legislators aren't necessarily seeking perfection. The mandates instead are intended to add friction to the gun printing process, so it isn't trivially easy for a novice with little technical know-how to manufacture weapons. In other words, the most advanced, potentially privacy invasive blueprint scanning option might not be needed to avoid running afoul of the authorities. The goal is to raise the bar so that you can't be a curious kid in your bedroom who is able to download a file, press print, and then you have a gun or 3D printed part, Semenza said. The unfortunate truth is that it doesn't stop every person from printing a gun, Semenza added. It's a similar solution to the piracy through file sharing services that started, I guess, with Napster and other services like LimeWire and stuff. Being able to have petty piracy is a different issue to having these vast networks of people sharing stuff. So similarly, sharing of these files is going to happen on a lot of those networks. So the distribution of those files, I think, would probably be also where you should go, not just installing blacklists on known naughty files. For such a system to actually work, approved printers would have to scan every file a user presents, regardless of whether that person has the slightest interest in guns. Well, it could just check the meta file, it could check the details of the file. There could be quick ways of checking whether this particular file is on a blacklist. One easier to achieve approach would check print jobs against a database of hashes, unique digital fingerprints tied to known gun or gun component files, and block the print if there's a match. Exactly, that's what I've been saying. I said this, now you have. The method is similar in concept to how tech platforms prevent the spread of child sexual abuse material by checking uploads against a database of known hashes maintained by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Yes, also I mentioned that, yes. That may sound straightforward, but critics say the fundamental way 3D printers work on a mechanical level would make it toothless. Any modification to a print file source code, even a trivially small one, produces a different hash, potentially bypassing detection while leaving the printed object functionally unchanged. Hashing only works when exact copies are involved. A second, more effective and more controversial approach involves the so-called predictive code scanning. Companies like Spain-based Print and Go claim that AI tools can analyze a CAD file before it prints and predict with a high degree of accuracy whether the resulting object would constitute a prohibited gun or gun component. This method goes beyond simply comparing exact fields listed on some databases. It in effect attempts to predict what a printer will spit out. Besides relying on a list of known guns, the self-trained detection method can spot a new modified ghost gun STL file that aren't in the database yet, Print and Go writes on its website. The second approach in particular has drawn backlash, and gun lovers aren't the only ones bristling at the idea of mandating gun file scanning on printers. An outpouring of hobbyists, independent makers, and right-to-repair advocates worry this type of on-device surveillance, even if well-intentioned, risks fundamentally usurping the open-source DIY ethos of 3D printing. It's a similar kind of concern people have with the internet from the 2000s, which was glorious anarchy, but now we are all living in the controlled App Store economy. Still evolving file scanning technology, some tell The Verge, could misidentify everyday objects like hoses or Nerf toys as possible guns. Yes, I agree. Worse still, makers say a no-print database that earnestly starts with gun files could be abused and expanded by corporate entities looking to enforce IP and copyright protections. Tech, ostensibly sold to stop shootings, in other words, may eventually prevent a maker from printing their own car part or novelty lamp. It's a big ball of stupid and I hate it. Seattle Makers founder Jeremy Hansen told The Verge. Hansen, who has been involved in various maker spaces since childhood and currently works to provide tools, workspaces, and know-how to other creators, worries efforts to implement blocking technologies into printers could stymie future makers. Hansen and his colleagues push back against the Washington requirement, helping lead to its eventual defeat. Another weaker bill that makes it illegal for anyone intending to manufacture unlicensed firearms to possess or share gun files was signed into law in late March. I see it as a toe in the door on controlling manufacturing, Hansen added. It's already illegal to have a homemade unlicensed gun, and this technology isn't efficient for manufacturing firearms, but it is a good way to sell it to the public. The actual mechanism for control is vague and remains undetermined. Other makers worry applying this form of censorware to printers could dissuade future creators from experimenting with the tech for fear of breaking a law. Popular 3D printer enthusiast and YouTuber Loyal Moses imagines a future where 3D printing moves to the basement and is viewed with a veneer of shady criminality. I don't think so. I think it's going to become the backbone of most of our industry. I think most manufacturing is going to be done in people's garages and small units with 3D printers. I think all the smarts will be shipped in modules. That's why there is a bottleneck when it comes to microchip manufacturing, in my opinion, because it controls the market. So anyone's going to be able to print stuff, but to actually make it smart, you're going to have to buy pre-approved components that are probably manufactured elsewhere. But all of the day-to-day objects that we use pretty much can be manufactured from local, smaller outfits in the future, I imagine. Older, pre-scanning dumb printers would become sought-after grey market commodities. More broadly, makers worry that scanning software could push 3D printing away from its open-source roots and toward a kind of closed, tightly controlled walled gardens that have come to define smartphones and social media. And while supporters of the bills argue these hypothetical slippery slope concerns may needlessly impede necessary action against guns, critics like Electronic Frontier Foundation Associate Director of Technology Policy and Research Cliff Braun note the mechanism at play could mark a point of no return. There is a difference between a slippery slope, saying someone is maybe going to do something in the future, and literally building the infrastructure to do that, Braun told The Verge. And that's what these bills do. This momentum around blueprint scanning reflects a new reality, says Nick Saplina, formerly the Senior Vice President for Law and Policy at the gun violence prevention group Everytown for Gun Safety. Everytown is a major supporter of the legal efforts across the country and has testified in numerous public hearings defending them. Saplina said gun printing technology has leapt forward, a claim that is supported, at least in part, by the increasingly sophisticated-looking weapons found in police raids around the world. These aren't the volatile, single-shot pea shooters of the mid-2010s. The FGC-9, one of the more popular gun designs online, fires multiple 9mm rounds without breaking, and its core components can be built with a printer costing as little as $200. FGC stands for F-Gun Control. Their use is no longer limited to gun nerds with too much time on their hands. The FGC-9 has been used by rebel forces fighting against Myanmar's military junta and seized from neo-Nazi cells in Europe. And while fully or even mostly 3D printed guns in the US are a tiny fraction of the millions of firearms in circulation, their numbers are increasing. In 2021, the New York Police Department said it recovered just a single 3D printed gun. In 2024, the number jumped to 109. Oh my goodness. A separate 2024 Everytown report found similar results in 20 other cities. In Seattle, 3D printed guns recovered from crime scenes increased from 34 in 2021 to 84 in 2024. In Detroit, recoveries increased from 21 to 57 during that same period. It's still not that much, really, in the grand scheme of things. I'd say. This increase in 3D printed gun recoveries comes as recoveries of ghost guns generally, which can be made from an assortment of non-3D printed parts, have trenched downward in recent years. Experts link the recent decline of non-3D printed gun seizures to 2022 federal rules requiring serialization of so-called 80% DIY gun kits. 3D printed guns which can skirt around these new serial number requirements, the theory goes, are potentially filling that market gap for criminals. Well, they're criminals if they're not allowed to have those guns. If you are allowed to make your own, then you're not a criminal for making your own, surely. Citing that momentum, Saplina said it's time to pump the brakes on 3D printed guns before they reach escape velocity. What we're seeing is that typical patterns like you would with an outbreak, he said. Small numbers doubling year over year to a point where we realize that action right now is critical, or else we're going to have an unmanageable problem very, very soon. This is the same kind of panic that was all the rage during the pandemic. Wilson, who has fought back against 3D printed gun regulation since the technology's inception, pushes back on that framing. You're going from statistically negligible to statistically identifiable, Wilson told The Verge. But that doesn't mean it's overtaking a meaningful share of the criminal gun activity yet. Well, they don't sound very reliable. When asked how file scanning technology would work on 3D printers, supporters repeatedly point to the success paper printers have had in preventing the proliferation of counterfeit money. Since the mid-1990s, paper printers have been programmed to detect a hidden pattern embedded in real bank notes and refuse to reproduce them. This process started with $100 notes and eventually expanded to include all denominations other than $1 bills. For the most part, it's been a success. This is the analogy here, Saplina said, of preventing paper printers from making counterfeit money. You go to the source, you stop the firearms from being printed on the printer. That is the way to stop this problem in its tracks. Print and Go says it uses AI and pattern matching to analyze print jobs and compare files against a maintained database of known firearms and components. If the system flags a high enough likelihood of a weapon part, it stops the print. The company says its software can be installed directly into a printer's firmware, meaning the protection works even when the printer isn't connected to the internet. John Amin, Print and Go's founder, told The Verge his company began developing the current software after they heard about students bringing 3D printed guns to school. The paper printer comparison was used as evidence something like this was potentially in reach for 3D printers. The technology is developed to protect, not piss off, Amin said. In a follow-up email, Amin told The Verge his company is collaborating actively with both Everytown and the New York Governor's Office. The comparison to anti-counterfeiting tools in paper printers only goes so far. In that case, printers are looking for known banknote identifiers and preventing those from being printed. And the identifiers on the bills are designed explicitly to be detectable. Most people never realize printers have this software because it's so specifically tailored to forge currency. Successfully stopping prints of gun parts, on the other hand, might require targeting such a broad range of shapes as to block completely unrelated parts. Makers and technologists told The Verge they are skeptical of how well the scanning tech could work in practice. Braun describes the process in general as sensorware and questions whether average consumer printers have enough processing power to run meaningful geometric analyses locally. They could be done in the cloud, I suppose. If they don't, he said, manufacturers may have no choice but to route files through third-party cloud servers. I'm basically a few sentences in front of you, raising the prospect of slower print times, false positives and exposures of users' private files to the printer manufacturer or potential hackers. Yeah, that's a general risk for the modern world, though. Even if those problems are solved, Braun argues, bad actors will simply make incremental modifications to their files to slip past detection. There is an infinite number of ways for people to sidestep this, Braun said, and a natural consequence of making this work is that you're going to start preventing people from printing things they want to print just to fix their household appliances. Armin, meanwhile, said his company's false positive rate is low and continually improving, but nonetheless admitted some errors would inevitably occur. Perfect systems don't exist, he said. Past efforts to limit the proliferation of firearms files online have fallen short for two closely related but distinct legal reasons. Platform protection under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996 and First Amendment protections for the code itself. Section 230 famously absolves platforms from liability for content uploaded by their users. The same reasoning that has shielded gun marketplaces like armslist.com, the so-called Craigslist of guns, from negligent suits brought by gun violence victims, and that prevents file-sharing sites like Thingiverse or printables.com from being inundated with lawsuits when users upload gun files. Many of those repositories voluntarily remove gun files anyway under their terms of service. Thingiverse, for example, recently agreed to implement AI scanning and human review of flagged uploads after Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg sent a letter documenting gun files still appearing on the platform despite its long-standing prohibition. The question of whether gun code is also protected speech is even more complex and still in dispute. Sites like DefCAD and Wilson's Defense Distributed, whose explicit mission is to share gun files, have had to argue in court that restricting 3D printed gun files violates the First Amendment. Courts haven't been entirely clear on that issue. In February, the Third Circuit upheld a New Jersey ban on sharing 3D printed gun files, ruling that purely functional computer code doesn't carry the same First Amendment protections as expressive code, and that defense distribution had failed to demonstrate its files fell into the protected category. Supporters of the code as speech argument have long held that all computer code at a fundamental level should be considered a form of expression. This ruling was interpreted by legal experts to have narrowed that understanding. Well, I'm not sure that's true. Code is functional, it makes stuff happen, so it's much more comparable to technical Lego or some kind of engineering components that you can use to make machines. That's not really speech, in my opinion. These files are not expressive speech, they're purely functional code that leads to illegal lethal weapons in the wrong hands, said Soplina. Well, that's the whole crux of the issue there. Wrong hands. So instead of concerning yourself with the fact that these files exist, maybe you should concern yourself more with the wrong hands part of this equation. That would be my take. Wilson, whose company sued the New Jersey Attorney General over enforcement of the ban, told The Verge he thinks the issue of whether or not code is speech will likely wind up before the Supreme Court. I don't think it is speech, no. Legal battles over blueprint scannings are primarily taking place in New York and California, but passage anywhere could have ripple effects nationwide. If a larger state like California passes its bill, Braun said manufacturers like Bamboo Lab or Prusa Research may simply opt to include scanning software on all the new models, regardless of whether they're sold, rather than maintain separate product lines. Scholars often refer to this hedging of bets to avoid litigation as the California effect in a variety of industries from software to car manufacturing. Others who host files may cut off access to those particular states to avoid potential legal liability. Wilson told The Verge he's preparing to turn off access to Defense's distributed gun files for users with IP addresses from affected states. Some printer manufacturers, particularly smaller players with less financial wiggle room, may simply exit those markets altogether. Our printers are made in Czech Republic, Hansen said. They simply won't sell in Washington if they have to jump through these hoops. This is an issue that's going to be requiring laws across the world, I suppose. Whatever country there is, if guns are illegal in general, any of these files are illegal. So they're trying to make these files illegal in general in America. Good luck with that. I can see this being rushed through in other European nations maybe, where they don't really understand the importance of self-defense. Lawmakers pushing forward these mandatory gun blocking software systems are hoping to get voluntary buy-in from the 3D printer industry. During a ghost gun demo with reporters earlier this year, David Stewart, chief of the counter-terrorism unit at the New York County District Attorney's Office, told The Verge they have met regularly with printer manufacturers and file hosting sites. Those meetings reportedly led several 3D printer manufacturers to update their user agreements and policies to prohibit firearm manufacturing. At least one file hosting site also notified users that printing firearms is illegal and not in compliance with their policies following the DA's outreach, Stewart said. A past letter from the New York DA's office addressed to printer maker Crealty specifically named Print and Go's 3D Gunt software. Oh, did you really want to use that word? Gunt? Really? Is that what you've called your software? Do we not know what that means? Many of us out there probably know what that means, and that's not a word we'd like to be hearing. Naughty. As a common sense safeguard, it could potentially implement. No 3D printer manufacturers or file hosting sites would comment on whether they supported the file blocking tech or how they intended to proceed in New York and California moving forward. FlashForge, Bamboo Labs, Snapmaker, Prusa, Creality, MakerWorld, and PrintTables.com also did not respond to requests for comment. In an email statement, Hugo Fromont, who the heck is this chap now, co-founder of the prominent 3D printer file marketplace Cults, that's who he is, said it already takes steps to remove models that violate the law, and said that sharing firearm blueprints is absolutely forbidden. You must not do that under the company's terms of service. Concerns around this technology aren't limited to accuracy and privacy. Makers told The Verge that well-meaning efforts to limit gun files open a Pandora's box where other objects could be added to the no-print database over time. Exactly. What else are you going to add to this? What else is going to be banned? I mean, I guess things are going to have to be banned. I don't know. We tend to have a world where things occasionally are banned. I don't think I'm allowed to have a nuclear weapon. Am I? No, I don't think so. That's banned. Once that infrastructure exists, they warn corporate entities could lobby to expand it to protect their intellectual property. That strikes at the core of the right to repair movement. Benjamin Heckeldorn, good old name that, an engineer and 3D printing enthusiast who's spoken out against the new bill on YouTube, described them as a kind of Trojan horse. I don't even think these laws are about guns. Heckeldorn, who goes by the name Ben Heck Hacks, told The Verge in an email. The real goal is stopping all the IP infringing stuff that people print. If you think companies like John Deere, Disney or Nintendo aren't going to be interested in a world where your printer can automatically recognize and block objects that resemble their IP or their products, you're not paying attention to how aggressively big brands defend control when tooling exists. Loyal Moses speculated in a video criticizing AI file detection. When The Verge asked whether Print and Go's database would eventually be expanded beyond firearms, Armin didn't entirely rule out the possibility. Whether these anxieties around IP enforcement actually come to pass may depend less on gun blocking tech as a concept and more on the exact type of software process that's implemented. A basic hashing approach, while easily bypassable, has much less inherent risk for abuse than a less proven prediction approach. Regardless of what anyone thinks about the merits of stemming the tide of guns, the blocking tech mandates under consideration would mark an inflection point in the trajectory of 3D printing as a whole. Printers, like so much else of the digital world, would now essentially require permission to work. The question of whether to alter 3D printing's path may then ultimately rest on how gravely one really views the threat of homemade printed firearms. And in a country where the total number of firearms has been estimated to outnumber people, and where gun show loopholes and other trivial workarounds undermine even basic background check requirements, the threat of 3D printed guns can feel premature. Still, the uptick in high-profile violence involving printed firearms in recent years has awakened momentum for change, even if the most ambitious form of gun scanning tech are held at bay. It seems inevitable the earlier Wild West era of 3D printed firearm access is nearing its end. Oh, I don't know. I think you need to focus a little bit more on the people who are using these guns for bad reasons. And most people, if they want a gun, if they're like, hey, I'm a guy, I want a gun, they would go buy a gun. They go to a gun store, they talk to a gun dude behind the gun desk, and they'd be like, here's some money, I want gun. He goes, here's gun, you give money. And then there's a gun in a man's hand, and it's a good gun. It's not a bad 3D printed gun made of plastic and it's going to explode in your hands or whatever. Most people aren't going to want shady 3D printed guns. If you have a 3D printer, do you really want a 3D printed gun? You probably do it for novelty's sake. You wouldn't be interested in actually using that for your personal protection so much as an actual gun. You know, a real one you can buy from a manufacturer that uses parts that aren't made out of injected gooey plastic. But I guess these things are getting much more sophisticated, so I shouldn't be that down on them. But I don't know, there was all that talk about gun kits and being able to buy deactivated guns, and all you needed to do was drill out this part here or that part there. And similarly, I'd imagine you could have files that pass detection that only need this part here filed away or that part there filed away or whatever. So I'm not sure if you're really determined to 3D print a gun, whether they're going to be able to stop that. So the only way to stop that, I think, is to get in front of the people who might want to do that. Keep an eye on them, maybe, because them's the naughty ones, and everyone else probably just wants to print a gun for, like, funsies. What does this do? Let's hope it doesn't blow my hand up. Thank you for joining me wherever you are. Hit the like button if you like what I do. But that is it for now. And the only thing I have left to say is Pigwig out.
Oink, oinkity, snort, snuffle, snuffle, squee, oink, oink, wee, squeal, snort, snort, oinkity, squee. Oink, 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 squee, squee, wee, 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 snuffle, snort, squeal, squeal, oinky, oink, snort, snort, squee, oink, 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 wee, 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 oh. Snort, snuffle, oink, squee, squeal, wee, snort, oinky, oinkity, oink, oink, snuffle, wee, squee, snort, oink, squeal. Oink, 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 squee, squee, wee, 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 snuffle, snort, squeal, squeal, oinky, oink, snort, snort, squee, oink, 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 wee, 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 oh. Oink, oinkity, snort, snuffle, snuffle, squee, oinkity, oink, oink, snuffle, wee, squee, snort, oink, squeal. Oink, 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 squee, squee, wee, 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 snuffle, snort, squeal, squeal, oinky, oink, snort, snort, squee, oink, 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 wee, 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 oh. Squeal, squeal. Snort, snuffle, oink, re, squeal, re, snort, oinky, oinkity, oink, 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 snuffle, re, squee, snort, oink, squeal, oink, oink, oinkity, squee, squee, re, 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 snuffle, snort, squeal, squeal, oinky, oink, snort, snort, squee, oink, 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 oink.